ado, I would like to open the floor for discussion. We will have 10 minutes of questions and answers, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions for the panelists. But I would like to invite Mr. Kobolєв to tell us a few details about the transit contract, to tell us why it was important to have a transit contract, and also to reflect beyond it in an era where we're moving away from gas and where Ukraine needs to find a new role.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you everybody for coming to listen to us. As you all probably know, in December and in November, myself and other representatives of Naftogaz were very skeptical of the fact if contract could be achieved at all, if that is something which could be signed, given the level of temperature in relationships, given the difficult history, and given the fact that from financial perspective, many traders who kept and still keep significant volumes of gas in European ground gas storages would benefit from crisis situation. All of that made, for example, myself believe that the crisis would be very difficult to avoid, and that also played a positive role for Naftogaz. We made every single effort to make sure that we were ready for the crisis. Creating the largest amount of gas kept in our underground gas storages. The same was done by many European countries. Preparing and finalizing unbundling, which was a big issue for the previous several years, and maybe I'll stop on that a bit later and describe why unbundling was such a big issue, and also why that created so much tension between Naftogaz and between the government, and many other steps which were taken by both Naftogaz and Ukrainian government in order to get ready. So when it suddenly appeared that there is a likelihood that contract could be signed, Naftogaz and our team made, I believe, all reasonable efforts to make sure that compromise could be found. And at the end of the day, acceptable compromise was found and was signed by Naftogaz and Gazprom. The new contract, you are right, is smaller in volumes than the previous one, but given the fact that Turkish Stream is basically online, is already functioning, and given the fact that Gazprom still reserves, not reserves, but there is an option for them to book additional capacity if they need so during periods when they need so the volumes can be bigger, that is a good achievement, mostly from the point of view of European market. You're right by saying that Ukraine was not buying gas from already 5 years, I was mistaken, from Russia. But in terms of European gas market, in terms of security of supply for European consumers, ensuring new transit contract was very important. And what we observe right now is that this positive outcome of potential conflicting situation has resulted in significant price decrease, which is currently enjoyed by many consumers in Europe. And we hope that in the nearest future, Ukrainian consumers will be also capable of benefiting from that price decrease. So that is probably brief description of what was signed. And there is still, as we discussed today with several experts, things that Ukrainian government mostly, and also Naftogaz partly, has to do, I love the expression which we heard today, beyond the unbundling. Because unbundling as such, formally, is just a milestone on a long road to proper functioning, transparent and efficient and fair gas market. And in this direction, Ukraine and us still have things to do. We still need to make sure that we resolve the issue of unauthorized offtakes of DSOs, distribution system operators. We still need to make sure that we cope with the problem of central heating generating companies, which are offtaking gas without paying money to Naftogaz or to any other supplier. We still need to make sure that our network code is fully appropriate. And by the way, if you read about criticism about the new contract, one of the lines which probably has the right to life is the fact that Gazprom is not subject to Ukraine regulation. Naftogaz is subject, Naftogaz is an agent for Gazprom, and Gazprom stays outside of Ukraine. On one point of view, that's a point of criticism, but on the other hand, we all know the problems with Ukrainian gas legislation. We all know the issues which still unfortunately remain unresolved. And from point of view of Gazprom, I do understand, as a person who is also engaged in dealing with Ukraine network code, that some issues which remain pretty problematic, potentially financially very damaging, was a very good and powerful excuse for them to stay so far outside Ukraine. When those issues are fixed, I sincerely hope that foreign companies, foreign gas traders will become more active in Ukrainian gas market, and then their presence and efficiency of their operations potentially may change the view of our Russian counterparty, and then may have direct contract for additional volumes directly with the newly established operator.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kopacz, you were very much involved in discussions. You were involved in the unbundling of the TSO, and you also represent the energy community, which is an EU institution designed to extend the EU's free trade principles to neighboring non-EU states. Of course, there was a rationale behind the European Union working with Ukraine immediately after the Maidan revolution and ensuring that there were no more so-called trade wars. Now, in a sense, we see there is a transit contract. Ukraine has made some progress towards aligning with EU rules. What needs to be done from now? As you said, when winning the war is not enough, then how do we organize the peace? How do we go about from here? What sort of level of engagement do you see from the European Union and from the energy community with regards to Ukraine?
Thanks first for the invitation. Happy or pleasure to be here. Energy community was somehow advisor, policeman, and in different roles in all these gas market reforms which were happening in the last years, and unbundling happily ended. Okay, now it has to be really implemented in practice, but I think that this is not an issue anymore. So this story, perhaps once there will be a book, I wouldn't like to come out with some memories too early, because there were very many also dirty stories, I would say, behind this non-unbundling, but doesn't matter. Happy end happened. Now we have it. A few problems or issues which are still open, mentioned already Andriy. But there are, of course, some more, especially things which were one thing which I wanted to say before I go into this is that sometimes history is ironic, you know, but in last months the biggest pusher of European-oriented gas market reforms in Ukraine was Gazprom. So somehow,
Absolutely.
Because President Putin said that if Ukraine will comply fully with the European rules, they will sign a transit contract, and then really Ukrainian authorities were really adopting all the necessary measures compliant with EU rules, which were previously not possible for years, you know. So it was a lucky coincidence, but now the baby has to further walk.
But sorry to interrupt you, but the question that many people in the audience will have here, if Gazprom was the main driver of the unbundling of the TSO, how come that they did not sign the contract with the TSO directly?
I don't know if I was not part of that particular negotiations in the very late stage, and I don't know how the discussions were going on. But perhaps they would sign a contract with the transmission system operator directly as well. I don't know. I don't want to go into guessing. But what I would like to say is that apart from problems which Andrei already mentioned, we have a huge issue where we can only very shortly take a breath, and this is financial sustainability of new transmission system operator. It will function now in next 5 years, but who knows what will be after 5 years. And of course, when designing further activities of the transmission system operator, you have to think on a very long run. Unauthorized offtake of gas due to the lack of payment of district heating companies was already mentioned. Distribution tariffs are not settled properly yet. And this is a huge issue which also then results in some offtakes of gas which influence financial sustainability of transmission system operator. Monetized system of subsidies for vulnerable customers exists, but further efforts for implementation, monitoring and decrease of the size are needed, because now it is simply not financially sustainable on the long run. And I would say establishment of a modern gas exchange. This is the lowest hanging fruit, this last one. And I think it would be the best proof of smoothly functioning gas market in Ukraine, and I hope that Ukrainian EBRD and Energy Community Secretariat offered full technical assistance to this, but of course we need cooperation of Ukrainian authorities. And let me use this particular event to send a call to ministry to now, after unbundling is over.
But the market will only develop if all these other elements are put in place, a functional market as we understand.
Yeah, but for a smooth, I mean for a lot of trust, you need a well-organized gas exchange. Only bilateral contracts are not enough.
Absolutely. Ambassador, I would like to move on to you. And this session, I would like the session to be forward-looking, because obviously Ukraine has the transit contract, but we need to look further afield. And let's not forget that the European Union has also some targets of moving away completely from gas. So I would like, perhaps, Ambassador, if we could reflect on two issues here. First of all, the role of Ukraine in the region. If Ukraine could maybe set an example, because in a way, Ukraine, of all the energy community members, is the poster child of the energy community contracting parties for transposing and implementing many of these network codes and many of these rules. Of course, it's still way behind, but it's more advanced than the others. So in one sense, perhaps you could reflect on how Ukraine could become a model for the region, and also if Ukraine could play a role in integrating Eastern Europe. Ukraine has lost that transit to Turkey and to the Balkans. Most of the gas is now diverted to Turk Stream. Can Ukraine still play a role in that region, and if so, how, and what sort of support could it get from the US?
I think you always need to look to the future, but you always need to look realistically at what the prospects are. The natural gas sector, including transportation in Ukraine, is an extraordinary success story. This was the place where the two great crises confronting Ukraine back in 2014, which is Kremlin aggression and corruption, came together. And the extraordinary success of Naftahaz and my colleague on the right, Mr. Kobolyev and his team, Mr. Vitrenko and others, to one, turn a huge energy diversion, or should say asset diversion, actually ground zero of corruption in Ukraine, into a contribution to the Ukrainian budget, and to remove Ukrainian dependence on the Kremlin was absolutely essential. Now, I didn't follow your instructions, I looked backwards. But I looked backwards in order to look forward. Ukraine has played a role already in a more sober European Union energy policy. The Ukraine crisis, which is actually the wrong way to describe it, the Kremlin aggression against Ukraine, the multifaceted Kremlin aggression against Ukraine, helped force the EU to become serious about the third energy package. And it helped force not just Europe, but the United States to understand the geopolitical consequences of Nord Stream 2. All of this gave a giant shove to Europe towards reduction of its dependence on the Kremlin for energy supply. That's already an extraordinary achievement, both within Ukraine and within Europe as a whole. There will be some building on this achievement in the year or two to come. It will happen because, in part, the gas deal, which we've already discussed, the congressional sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which makes me smile still, because there's a connection between that gas deal, the sanctions and the reasonable gas deal that Ukraine was able to achieve with the Kremlin. And while Merkel and Putin are talking about completing Nord Stream 2, at an absolute minimum, this is 2 years away, and I'm not going to predict that Nord Stream 2 is going to die, but I will tell you there's a pretty good chance it will. And that will mean that Ukraine's role as a transit company will remain, albeit not on the same scale as before. And what Ukraine needs to do in this context is make sure the pipeline and the storage system is working at world-class standards.
Can I stop you there? Sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Just please tell us why do you think that Nord Stream will die,
Well,
fade away?
for the project to be completed, you need to have a firm with the technological capacity to do the work, laying the pipes. Russia doesn't produce such firms. They've relied, despite having this extraordinary hydrocarbon capacity, on Western firms to do all of their difficult energy extraction. So you don't have a Russian firm to do this. And of course, the US sanctions are a body blow to any Western firm that wants to do business, because all roads or all networks lead to the United States. That may change over time, although I don't think it will. So yes, the Russians are going to, beat their breasts and say, we're going to make this happen. And by the way, the German reaction to the congressional sanctions has been timid, despite the concerns of many of my German friends who are on the right side of all these issues that the reaction was going to be catastrophic. I think that's partly because Merkel never really believed in it, although she has to take a position that she is in favor of it. And also, the Germans understand that this is a dirty deal. Maybe the SPD doesn't understand that, but most of Germany gets it. So that's why I think, again, Nord Stream 2 is at least 2 years delayed and maybe longer. It's very important that the United States continue to pay attention to this. And Congress did an extraordinary job. They didn't take a blunderbuss, a thing that destroys many things in order to reach a small target. They had a targeted sanction. They need to do that again now to make sure that any Western technology that might help a Russian firm be able to do this understands that they're going to be next if they go ahead with this. And they should be paying a lot of attention, we should all be paying a lot of attention to the machinations in Germany right now about somehow making sure that that progressive EU, actually I don't like that word progressive, sound EU energy policies apply to Nord Stream 2 in the new circumstances, right? The Bundestag just did something which is inconsistent with what I've just said, so we should call them on it.
But do you think, seriously, do you think that the US has a consistent policy towards Ukraine? It was just you a few days ago responding to George Beebe in an article about a realist perspective vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Well, my article made clear that there was nothing real or realistic about George's position. There was a lot of wishful thinking. The only realistic U.S. position is that we have a great stake, we have a vital interest in stability and prosperity in Europe. That's a cornerstone of global stability and of American prosperity. The Kremlin is pursuing a revisionist agenda in Europe, and the fight is right now in Donbass. We let Putin get away with murder, literally, in Georgia. We must make sure that Putin pays a high price in eastern Ukraine. He's already paying a high price. If we understand that, all this conversation about a vital American interest in a dialogue with Russia goes flying out the window. I am all for talking to the Kremlin and giving them some ground truth that we are much stronger than they are across the board. If they want to play nasty, we can play nastier, and they will be in worse shape. It's very simple. They remain a serious danger to American prosperity and security, but they are a manageable problem because their economy is so weak. China is a much more dangerous problem to the United States because they have a real economy. And there are smart people in Moscow who understand they don't have a real economy. And by a real economy, I mean an economy that will progress because the talents, the great talents, the extraordinary talents of the Russian people will lead to innovation, which will enable the people who bring that innovation to prosper. That's the key. That's what we mean about rule of law, about making sure people are able to get what they create. So that some captain in the FSB in some small Russian provincial city cannot steal a company of what could be a Russian Steve Jobs, which is essentially the Russian problem today. And we've seen, in fact, anyone who went to the Russian discussion on the economy yesterday, where they were denying that Russia has an economic problem because they were afraid of what the Kremlin might say, understands what I'm saying. Okay.
I shall come back, and I have a few more questions for you, but I would like to return to Mr. Kobolyev and ask him, as I asked in the beginning of this discussion, whether he sees beyond the transit contract and further possibilities of integrating the Ukrainian market with the European markets, either through infrastructure or through market integration, proper market integration. And if so, could you give some example, please?
It is important to understand that the new contract which was signed with Gazprom allowed us to remove legacy bottlenecks which existed in relationships between Ukrainian TSO, Ukrtransgaz, now it's a new company, and respective TSOs in European countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. Those obstacles, formal ones, were removed. And now those TSOs are capable of interacting fully in compliance. Well, it's not fully 100% yet, but in the nearest future, I would expect that all standard services and all standard interaction modes which are available in Europe will be available at the border of Ukraine and other EU countries, which will allow for Ukrainian market to play a more important role in European Union gas market. For example, everybody knows that our gas storage capacities are excessive for Ukrainian consumers. At least 10 billion cubic meters of gas additionally can be stored in Ukraine to the benefit of European consumers. That was difficult to achieve because of those bottlenecks. Now, when those bottlenecks are gone, Ukrainian underground gas storages using, among other things, short-haul tariffs, which I believe our regulator should approve, can become commercially viable. And such European countries, for example, as Poland, could enjoy additional element of energy security by keeping gas underground gas storage of Ukraine and then using for security of supply. On top of that, we also expect that situation which took place last summer will also continue in the midterm, meaning that excessive supply of LNG gas to European market will drive prices lower, creating significant margin between summer and winter prices, and that margin can be captured by those who will use Ukrainian underground gas storages. On top of that, gas transit through Ukraine can happen not only from east to west, but also, for example, from south to north.
Sure.
And Hungary, Poland, Slovakia can exchange gas flows also using Ukrainian gas transmission system. All of that combined should be beneficial for Ukraine because this is how Ukrainian GTS will make money, meaning more GDP, meaning more economic growth. But that should also be beneficial for European countries. It is more security of supply. It is another efficient route to transport gas.
Thank you. But I was also thinking in terms of infrastructure, because I remember a few months ago when I interviewed Klaus-Dieter Borchardt from the Commission, and he was saying that there are 4 high-pressure pipelines that link Ukraine to Austria via Slovakia. One of them could be made available, he said, for reverse flows, and that would be one element to link even further Ukraine to the Central European markets. Can you see a possibility to create a new corridor, to create a reverse corridor there?
Actually, this corridor already exists. So parallel to those 4 pipes, which are currently working from east to west, there is Viana-Uzhgorod pipeline, which is working from west to east. So there is a physical corridor. What Klaus-Dieter was mentioning, probably, as far as I can interpret, is that we could add one of old 4 these big pipelines to create firm capacity. So if there is no transit at all, then this pipeline could be used to transport gas from west to east, increasing capacity from Slovakia to Ukraine. But if we assume that transit will exist, virtual reverse flow becomes a much more important element for us. You don't need to physically transport gas. You can do swaps with European consumers, which were not available to us because of the legacy contract with Gazprom. Now, these swaps should become available, which will ultimately result in decrease of transportation cost on Ukrainian side, and will ultimately result in extended usage of probably Ukrainian underground gas system. That's what we expect. Okay. But that is something which is currently being discussed with Slovakian counterparties. Since the new TSO is independent from gas, I'm not fully aware of the status discussions, how big is the progress. But now the main bottleneck was removed. I believe in the nearest future, we will see all virtual flows available.
Thank you. Mr. Kopacz, back to you. I have a question which is very much on my mind. We know that Ukraine has signed the interconnection agreements, as Mr. Kobолєв said, with Hungary, with Poland, but of course there is one with Romania which has only been partially signed, and this is because we've come to a very strange and ironic situation where an EU country does not want to implement the network codes, whereas Ukraine, which is not an EU country, would like to implement these network codes. Why is this happening? Can you tell us? And do you foresee any possibility of clearing these gaps or plugging these gaps in order to allow greater integration of the Ukrainian system with the neighborhood?
Well, I would still be optimistic. It's really only, Slovakia, which has the biggest capacities, signed a key compliant interconnection agreement on 31st of December, I think?
Yes, it was the last connection agreement signed.
And Romania partially already respects a key, partially not. Energy community is unfortunately designed in the way that EU member states are not obliged to respect a key on the border with energy community contracting parties, while energy community contracting parties have to respect it vice versa. But we brought also the Romanian regulator to an agreement that they will voluntarily respect all the network codes on the border with Ukraine, and I think with some additional push from European Commission on Romania, things will be manageable. Okay, it didn't work in December, but December was full of so nice surprises that this was only it's a minor stone in mosaic, which I'm sure will be put into the whole picture soon.
Good. Ambassador, the US, of course, is one of the largest producers of LNG in the world, and we've seen that the share of production has increased from 4% in 2017, I believe, to about 15% this year or next year. LNG has already started to trickle through deep into Central Europe, and even in Eastern Europe. Bulgaria, for example, has started to import LNG, and we've also seen 2 cargoes delivered, or 2 cargoes, or 1 cargo to Poland for a Ukrainian company. Do you realistically think that US LNG could arrive in Ukraine and it could make a difference in the long term? Or do you think that this is really rather impossible? And
in the long term, I think it is highly likely that US LNG will arrive in Ukraine. But I say in the long term. Clearly, it would be wonderful, not likely, but it would be wonderful if Ankara opened the straits so that US could ship LNG directly to Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea. Obviously, Ukraine would have to build the LNG terminal. If this were a possibility, I think we would see that terminal. But that's a long shot, and that would require both deft American diplomacy, and we haven't seen such deft American diplomacy in decades. And also, it would also require statesmanship in Ankara, which we haven't seen in a long time, too. So that's one. But the reason why I say it will happen in the long term is Andriy already talked about reverse flow, which was an achievement both of Ukraine and the United States. I remember following, and to the extent I could, working these issues in 2014, making sure that the relevant countries in Central Europe were playing nicely. And there's definitely American LNG heading towards ports in the Baltic Sea. And that LNG will be added to the supply of gas to Europe, some of which will flow to Ukraine.
But you haven't mentioned Poland. You only mentioned Turkey and...
Haven't mentioned what?
Poland as a potential route.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They will flow to LNG ports in the Baltic Sea. And that could be Poland, it could be the Baltic states. But it's going to happen. And while I can't say with pride that, by and large, American statecraft has been a great contributor to global prosperity and stability in recent years, and I'm not just talking about the current administration, the American economy has been. What we produced with fracking and with LNG is a signal achievement which has seriously reduced American dependence, or excuse me, world dependence, on hydrocarbons coming from the volatile Middle East. Big deal. And of course, reducing dependence on hydrocarbons coming from the exploitative east of Europe. So this is a positive development which is already being felt indirectly in Ukraine and will be felt directly over time.
For Kobolєвим, regarding governance, the governance of Naftogaz, Naftogaz has improved a great deal, clearly, as your article said. Do you foresee any challenges, any political challenges that could befall the company in the upcoming years? Do you think there is a risk of any political intervention or any political influence on Naftogaz or the new TSO as we go forward?
I would say that January of this year will be critically important for continuation of the corporate governance reform of Naftogaz. Those of you who were monitoring developments around the company, you probably noticed that last year there were many interventions made by the previous government into Naftogaz charter. Some of them, from point of view of our legal team, are even clearly against the law. Some of them violate major principles of corporate governance promoted and developed by OECD. Some of them were clearly against the ideas which were initially agreed in 2015 between previous government and such international institutions as IMF, World Bank, EBRD. I know that currently, while we are talking, our team back in Kiev is negotiating with the Ministry of, not just negotiating, I would say, they're discussing with the Ministry of Economy how Naftogaz charter should look like. And as far as I know, the KPI that the new government has is to implement OECD-compliant charters in all major SOEs, including Naftogaz. If that happens, that, from my point of view, would mean that the new government is committed not only to maintain status quo or, let's say, preserve the achievements of the past, but move even further. Because the charter we are currently discussing is a pretty progressive one, which clearly moves significant portion of authority from our shareholder to supervisory board and to executive board. And if you look at the past, whether this authority was used efficiently by previous representatives of shareholder, the clear answer is no. A simple example, financial plan of Naftogaz was not adopted until the very, very end of December for several years, which makes this document pretty obsolete and unnecessary. And but to stay fully open and frank, if you look at financial plan of Naftogaz, the way previous governments wanted us to submit, and if you ask any minister in the government whether he is firstly having enough time to read the document, secondly has capacity to digest, and thirdly has ability to give comments which are relevant, the honest answer is probably would be for any government no. Those are huge, huge documents, and they were initially designed, from my point of view, long time ago for a very different reason. And the reason was indulgence for corruption. Financial plan of Naftogaz will use indulgence for Naftogaz management to spend money, and it was like a permission. And that permission was given in exchange for something usually, for different things. So all those archaic elements, they should be removed, and there should be proper corporate governance. And I very much hope that by the end of January, we will see a new charter of Naftogaz, which will be compliant with OECD, and when new parliament will be able to adopt a law on corporate governance, which, as far as I know, was already submitted there, and also allow some pieces of authority which remain at the shareholder level to be moved to supervisory board, for example, that will be a huge achievement, and that will ensure that corporate governance reform is not only continuing, but advancing at appropriate pace.
Thank you very much. Now, I would like to open the discussion to the public. If you have any questions, please put your hand up so I can see you, and then stand up and ask the question, please. Please.
I have a question to. Thank you. I have a question to Mr. Kopacz. Europe was at a very unique situation. Europe was facing a situation where it could have a very strong competition between various gas sources, LNG from the US. It built very substantial LNG import capacity, but it could also be competition from additional gas flows from Russia through Nord Stream 2, and also Europe could have competition between various transit routes for Russian gas, Ukraine, Nord Stream 2, Turk Stream, and so on. So this would create competition. For a decade before that, Europe has been fighting for, European Commission has been fighting for competition in gas transit routes by, for example, effectively banning long-term contracts, at least for existing systems, which had their capital cost fully paid. Somehow, in this situation, Europe accepted and was almost advocating a situation where a long-existing system with fully recouped capital base would receive a shipper pay monopoly with fixed volumes, something that was anathema in Europe for many years already. So why there was a double standard, why Europe has supported in this case. And also why is it that Europe so kindly accepted the lack of competition, the lack of additional gas flows from Russia, where I can't understand how these additional flows from Russia could put in danger European energy security, while Europe has already had so many LNG ports, additional flow of supply of LNG from the US. However, I see that this decrease in competition would make gas more expensive for European consumer, and there would be value transfer to US LNG and shale gas producers and Ukraine as a transit country. So how these recent developments are in the interest of European consumer?
Many questions for, let's say, 5 minutes. So Europe is big, and it has. And when we talk about gas, there are two Europes. There is Europe with high liquidity of gas markets, and there is Europe with lower liquidity of gas markets. This Europe is 1/3 of Europe, of European Union, coming from Finland down to Greece. So this eastern part of European Union is a market with lower liquidity. So this part of European Union was always stressing security of supply. And the other part of European Union was always stressing competition. And the idea of energy union, which was launched by Polish Prime Minister, later President of the European Council, Mr. Tusk, stemmed out of this question, security of supply. So I just want to say, in European Union, you have two approaches, two languages, and they always have to find a compromise. And this compromise, in case of Nord Stream 2, was for a very long time not found. In the very last moment, it was. Also, the developments in Europe always bring changes in statements. Just an illustration. In the beginning, as you mentioned, Europe was fighting for diversity and competition and so on, but then it happened that there were no new investments. So the third energy package, which has a possibility of an exemption, was widely used for all new infrastructure only for an exemption, because real competition among investors didn't exist. And so Trans-Adriatic pipeline, exemption. Turkish Stream through Bulgaria, exemption. Nord Stream 2, most probably exemption. Okay, it was not decided yet by the German regulator and European Commission, and so on. So this development of energy infrastructure, if anywhere in European Union, is still needed in this eastern 1/3 of European Union. West has enough of infrastructure. Now they are thinking about a parallel one for hydrogen, because gas is not so fashionable anymore. But who knows what will be in 5-10 years. And that's how it develops. So your question was, why double standards, if I understood correctly, and I'm trying to explain that European Union, which then on the end always has to talk with one language, has two different constituencies. One is with high liquidity, and one is with much lower liquidity of gas market, and this is the reason why statements are then sometimes not completely balanced.
Please. Sorry, we have someone here. Sorry, yes, okay.
Didn't
An unusual,
but
an unusual question, not to the panelist, to a panelist, but to a gentleman who has just asked a question. Because we're lucky, basically, to have a representative of Gazprom in our room who just asked this question and expressed concerns about competition in Europe. So I would like to ask Sergei Vakulenko, representative of Gazprom, if Gazprom, being so concerned about competition in Europe, would allow independent producers from Russia to export gas out of Russia. And we know that, and as well as, again, producers and exporters of Central Asian gas from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. We know that you used to defend your position that the Russian legislation doesn't allow you or others to export, but again, we have Russian lawyers confirming that it was not the case. So in fact, it's allowed. You are just by the law, you are the only export channel. But it means that you can provide so-called swap services, basically, or swap contracts to other producers, efficiently, basically allowing them to move gas out of Russia and then to become, for example, network users of the Ukrainian gas transmission system, selling their gas in Europe, creating competition, so adding demand, and acting to the benefit of European consumers that you're so concerned about. So please answer this question if Gazprom will allow like a real competition for gas going through Russia and out of Russia.
My answer will be extremely simple. I don't work for Gazprom. I work for Gazpromneft. Gazprom is our shareholder. I work for an oil company, so I'm not in any position to speak on behalf of my shareholder.
You're producing gas as well?
Yes, we are producing gas as well, and we sell our gas domestically, and we are perfectly satisfied with the netbacks we get.
Poor European consumers, they're suffering without the gas.
No, European gas. I'm not saying that European consumers are suffering without gas. What I'm saying that another country with a problem of where to place gas, with some gas that might be actually locked for the lack of economic supply, is fighting for freeing some space for its gas in European market, which eventually would probably lead for increase in the price because lower cost Russian gas wouldn't be able to make it to that market. So I'm asking, why is Europe content with it? Countries do pursue their commercial interest, and I'm perfectly comfortable with it. If I were a representative with the country with a substantial problem of where to put LNG, and the problem is such that shale producers have to curtail their oil production because they have to flare their gas, and they can't flare enough. So yes, I would probably use every tool at my disposal to defend the market and to keep the competition away. What I don't understand is why the consuming country or block of countries is content with it.
But if you allow, I would like to comment that what Mr. Kopach mentioned, you asked. In reality, I would disagree with representative of Gazpromneft. LNG gas is a factor of price decrease, not a factor of price increase. So far, abundance of LNG and necessity of US exporters to put this gas somewhere, and not only, by the way, from US, but also from Russia. Novatek is a big supplier of LNG from Russia to Europe. And LNG is simply pushing out pipeline gas because they're prepared to compete, they're prepared to drive prices low. So in our experience, it's vice versa. And even Ukrainian consumers are already feeling the difference. The price decrease this summer, which we enjoyed, Ukrainian households enjoyed, was there's an outcome of the abundant LNG during the summer. So in reality, the fact that LNG competes, it's good for final consumers, it's good for Europe, and it's good for importing countries. For example, it's good for Ukraine.
Yes, but if there would be additional channel of supply from Russia, with additional chances of supply, additional volumes from Russia, these prices would go down even further.
But this channel does exist. Ukrainian system has capacity of 140 BCM per year. It's being used only by 90. If you are so much concerned, as you said, of prices of European consumers, just send more gas through our system, and but you will achieve the same outcomes. There is no need for new pipeline.
If I can add, Kommersant 2-3 days ago published latest data about the market share in European Union in 2019. I know because I was asked to comment. And the data are interesting. I mean, the share of gas from Russia increased, but the share of Gazprom's gas decreased. And where is the difference? It's Novatek. Novatek is now the winner of this new situation, and of course it brings benefits to European consumers, and it's coming from Russia.
Then how the construction of additional supply channel to Europe would put European energy security in danger?
Who says it will?
Mr. Harris.
No, what I said, actually, I didn't specifically address this, but what Nord Stream 2 does, it gives Russia the opportunity, as it has done several times in the past, to blackmail countries of Eastern Europe, which are low in gas. Like when it stopped the supply of gas to Ukraine, when I was ambassador there in the winter of 2005-06, they did it again in 2009. You did it with Belarus. The Kremlin has unfortunately played geopolitical games with gas supply, and Nord Stream 2 enables it to do that more efficiently. And we know that Nord Stream 2 is not in the interest of the Russian taxpayer. Sberbank had an analysis on its website until it was taken down a couple of years ago, pointing out that this made Russians spend money it did not need to spend. The only Russians who benefited economically were the cronies around, the Господин Президент.
Could you please ask a question briefly?
Yes, I want to draw our attention to a little bit different thing, because I think that most people that gathered here agree that monopoly is bad, and like 45% is already too much. But I am coming to the issue of production. So Ukraine basically has the best capacity to grow internal production. And that's what is good for consumers. So my question is to Andrei, how you see, what is your vision on the future of the market? Do you believe that in the current situation of the low prices, there is a potential for internal production to grow? Do you see the potential of outside investors coming to the country? And what are those investors who can help country grow? Or whether the Naftogaz would be the main driver for the production in Ukraine?
There is no secret that Naftogaz has been struggling with growing production, especially last year. That struggle can be explained by several factors, some internal ones, we don't hide that, but also external, such as lowering gas prices, such as limited access to new fields, such as resistance we had at various levels, starting from the central government, ending up at local governments. So whether under new pricing conditions there can be created a regime which will be, on one hand, allowing to grow production, on the other hand, to do it in an economically feasible way, meaning there would be no value destruction, as did happen in the past sometimes. That's a still question which remains to be seen. And Naftogaz, as a group, what we're doing right now, we're testing several hypotheses about new areas of production, where we're trying to firstly understand ourselves whether we can produce there in economically sustainable way. And again, the answer to that questions is still not clear to us, but we hope that somewhere by the end of April, May, at least one of those hypotheses, probably two of them, will be tested. Going back to attraction of foreign investors, I know that you represent a company that participated in a contest which was finally cancelled. And whether new government would be willing to design proper contest that would actually attract real big names, not just small companies who are willing to come and who are willing to compete sometimes on non-transparent basis, again remains to be seen. And on top of tackling usual rule of law issue in Ukraine, I think designing proper terms and conditions which would attract, let's say, companies, at least our partner Vermilion, not only one of them, but several of them. That would be criteria of proper contest, and that would be the way to attract foreign investors.
Because we've reached our time, I would like all the panelists in one sentence to say what is the biggest opportunity for Ukraine in the years ahead, but also the biggest risk that it faces.
The biggest opportunity, we're talking about in the energy field, correct?
Yes.
Okay. the big
But you can expand if you
Well, no,
have,
no.
if you think that there is an overriding opportunity somewhere else.
the biggest opportunity is to complete the already extraordinary reforms in the gas sector. We've seen this with, with price reform. We're now beginning to see it with unbundling, and also with the modernization of the transportation system. All those things to complete a process which is already well along is plausible. Is going to happen, and it'll be a very good thing.
And the biggest risk?
The biggest risk is that the still potent Kremlin efforts to politicize gas supply will ultimately prove successful. I don't think it will, but I can't absolutely rule it out.
Mr. Kobole?
I would say our biggest opportunity in the nearest future is to become independent from gas imports, which can be achieved by going in two directions simultaneously. Firstly, as Ilya suggested, growing domestic production of gas. Secondly, decreasing gas consumption. We're still pretty inefficient country, even compared to our Eastern European neighbors. The biggest risk, I would say, populism. It is currently something which bothers me, what I see in some reactions even from you young politicians, their desire to be super popular and loved and to avoid sometimes painful and unpopular measures.
Mr. Kovac?
I would say the biggest opportunity is energy efficiency. If energy efficiency measures would be massive, and I think they could be, and they could be even a good investment opportunity, then this would have tremendous effects on everything in energy, including gas. For example, Ukraine would become an net exporter of gas. But the biggest risk which I see is currently not in gas sector, because these reforms are, let's say, 80% done now. I mean, they need to be further fine-tuned, but otherwise we are out of crisis in gas sector. Now, next big step is electricity market, which is very shaky currently, with a lot of political interventions, and we have now crisis meetings related to this in these days, but hopefully in a year from now we will perhaps tell another success story, hopefully.
And I just can't help it, since Mr. Vitrenko is in the room. I would also like to ask him what he thinks is the biggest opportunity and biggest risk that Ukraine faces for the next couple of years.
To be more specific and more limited in terms of my view, so I would talk about not just the whole energy sector, but the gas sector in particular. Yes, we have signed this new contract with Gazprom, but this contract needs to be implemented properly, and we need to perform certain services. Also, I would disagree with Mr. Kopic that unbundling per se was kind of a key factor that influenced the signing of this contract, so I kind of know it from within. It has to do with the European rules that we were able to include into this contract, the new contract. But Gazprom basically insisted on something completely different. And they, as we all know, they wanted to continue the contract with Naftogaz, the current contract that is not compliant. So unbundling and implementation of European rules allowed us to make this new contract compliant with European rules. But now we need to use these European rules in order to unlock the potential of the gas market of Ukraine, in order to be able to attract other network users for transit, so that it's not just Gazprom who is transiting gas through Ukraine, and that we are able to finalize the integration with the European market, that we can have a fully liquid market in Ukraine. To an extent, we see it in Germany. And this work is ahead of us. So again, we bought a ticket to a high-speed train, but we should not miss this train. And there is a risk, speaking of the risks, that we will miss this train, because what I see now, that people sometimes don't understand how it works. They don't understand that, again, they need to make some efforts, and these reforms are not over yet.
Thank you. With this, we conclude our session, and hopefully next year there will be another one on electricity, maybe.
Thank you very much for this extraordinary, truly extraordinary panel. Thank you to our speakers for so generously sharing with us your time and your expertise. And very importantly, on behalf of the Ukraine House Organizing Committee, we would like to thank Naftogaz Group and FIOG, and you, Mr. Andriy Kobolyev, CEO, our gold sponsor, for playing a very large role in making Ukraine House Davos, this week's events, happen. We're very grateful to you. Thank you.
Actually, it's our honor to sponsor this event.